It's February 1861. We're on the Flinders River Delta in Queensland. Robert O'Hara Burke cannot believe what he's seeing. After nearly 6 months of wandering, Burke has finally laid eyes on his goal. He's reached the Gulf of Carpentaria on Australia's northern coast. He embraces his second in command, William John Wills. They've done it. They've crossed the continent. But as the two men celebrate, there's a nagging doubt in their minds. The job is only half done. Now they have to make it home. And with only 27 days worth of supplies left, they aren't going to make it alone. The two men are now hundreds of miles beyond the most remote European settlements. The only help they can hope for is from local indigenous groups, the people who have lived and thrived on this land for thousands of years. But at precisely the same time as Burke and Wills are stumbling out of the bush on the Flinders Delta, Lieutenant Rudolph Morisset is having his own contact with Indigenous Australians elsewhere in the Queensland colony. At a watering hole near Munamba, Morisset and his native police squad happen upon two Indigenous men. The police draw their guns and shoot them dead. At an old camping ground later that day, they murder another Indigenous man. Then, crossing the range on their way back to Yabba, Morisset and his men claim another victim. They'll kill as many as 8 people on this bloody spree. Many of the victims are elderly. All are unarmed. And this is not an isolated incident. This is part of a systematic campaign of dispersal in the Queensland colony. Basically, this means driving Indigenous populations from their land and shooting anyone who doesn't play ball. Burke and Wills can't actually know about this, though. They're on the other side of Australia. And these ragged, exhausted men are quite fortunate because the Gugaj people, native to the region, haven't yet heard about it either. The Gugaj have already fed and sheltered them and guided them across the Flinders Delta. But now, as their fellow Europeans ravage the Indigenous peoples, Burke and Wills will rely on their generosity more than ever. Without it, they simply won't survive. It was August 20th, 1860, when Robert O'Hara Burke and William John Wills set out from Melbourne's Royal Park. Their aim was a simple one: to cross the continent of Australia from south to north. And they were well prepared. Along with 19 men, 23 horses and 26 camels, the party had enough food to last them for 2 whole years of exploration. Among their equipment were plenty of rifles and revolvers, and bizarrely, a Chinese gong for signalling purposes. In total, the party carried around 20 tons of supplies. There were too many people to cover in depth here, but it's important to familiarise ourselves with some of the key figures in the story. So, Robert Burke was a 40-year-old explorer from County Galway in Ireland, and he led the expedition. George James Lowndes was second in command, born in Barbados. He was in charge of the camels and had been in Australia for only 4 years. William Wills, from Devon, was third in command, and his role was surveyor, cartographer, and astronomer. William Brahe of Paderborn in Germany, and the Irishmen, Thomas Francis MacDonagh, William Patton, and John King, were all assistants on the trip. While Dost Mohammed was one of the 4 camel drivers, he came from Ghazni in Afghanistan. Almost immediately, this multicultural party ran into trouble. It took them an entire day to traverse the few miles from the Royal Park to Essendon, today a suburb of Melbourne. By the time they left Essendon, 3 of their wagons had broken down. 1 had never even made it out of Royal Park. Things didn't get much better from there either. Brutal rains turned the Victorian trails into mires, and the party floundered on their way north to Swan Hill. Here, they were joined by another man, the Scottish runaway sailor Charles Grey. By September 15th, however, 26 days after they set off, they had at least left Victoria. But it was all just too slow. Burke began making changes. He fired several of the party and left many of their supplies behind as they pushed northwards. That 2-year supply of food was already dwindling. But another setback was just around the corner, and it came from an argument over rum. The party had 270 litres of this liquor, which they believed would prevent their camels coming down with scurvy. Burke wanted to dump the stuff, but his second-in-command, Landells, wanted to keep it. Burke got his way, Landells resigned, and William Wills was promoted to second-in-command. They pushed on, reaching Menindee on October 12th, and it had taken them close to 2 months to travel these measly 470 miles. This slow progress might have been fine if they were exploring uncharted territories, but they weren't. They'd been a European settlement at Menindee since the 1840s. There was even a regular mail coach shuttling back and forth from Melbourne, taking about a week to complete its journey. That coach probably passed the struggling explorers multiple times on their 2-month trek north. And there was another problem too. As the Burke party was leaving Victoria, the fabled explorer John McDowell Stuart was preparing his own expedition from South Australia. Stuart wouldn't begin his journey until the following January, but Burke didn't know this, so he decided to pick up the pace and divided his party at Menindee. Wills, Bray and Patton, along with McDonough, King, Gray and Dost Mahomet, would join Burke on the journey north. The 8 men would be guided by the local cattle farmer William Wright, as well as 2 indigenous men. By following many of the ancient pathways used by peoples of inland Australia, Burke and his party finally started making progress. When they reached Cooper Creek on November 11th, they were right on the edge of the territory explored by Europeans. Now, they would begin to venture into the unknown. But that would have to wait. Summer was upon them, with temperatures pushing far beyond 50 Celsius. The expedition would have to take a break. The plan was to wait 4 months before starting up again the following autumn. But Burke was increasingly impatient. He began making plans for the next phase of the expedition. First, he sent William Wright south to Menindee to bring supplies back to the camp at Cooper Creek. This way, at least they'd have a resupply depot for the return journey. Then, after waiting only 5 weeks, he set off, taking Wills, King and Gray, along with 6 camels and 1 horse. This seemed like suicide. Rather than avoid the height of summer, they were blundering directly into it. And what's more, they now only had 3 months' worth of food with them, and well over 1,000 miles to traverse to the northern coast. But it seemed like the party's luck had begun to turn. The recent rains meant the water was in plentiful supply, and the smaller party made rapid progress. When they reached the Bynoe River on February 2nd, 1861, Burke noticed something. The water was salty and seemed to be affected by the tide. They must be near the coast. This must be close to their goal. But actually, reaching this goal meant traversing hundreds of miles of swamp, and they were running dangerously low on supplies. Undaunted, Burke and Wills decided to set out alone. Only they weren't really alone. They were now in the lands of the Gugaj, and of course, the Gugaj perceived this land quite differently to Burke and Wills. To indigenous groups like the Gugaj, this wasn't dangerous, inhospitable territory at all. They'd been thriving on the abundance of nature for thousands of years here, and the sight of these 2 ragged white men stumbling out of the bush must have been quite amusing to the Gugaj. But, it must be said, the locals did take pity on them, and they gave them shelter and food, and showed them the way to the sea. If it wasn't for the assistance of the Gugaj, there's a good chance our story would end right here, on the briny southern reaches of the Flinders Delta. And there's a grim irony to this generosity. See, at the same time, in the east of the colony, the Queensland authorities were beginning their violent campaign of dispersal against the local indigenous populations. The previous year, Lieutenant Carr and his native police attacked a camp of around 100 indigenous people. The ensuing gunfire went on for over an hour, and by the end, at least 15 people were dead. In January 1861, Lieutenant Frederick Wheeler carried out a night ambush on a camp near Dugandan. and it's possible that as many as 40 died in this raid. Lieutenant Morisset and his men carried out their own raid between February 10th and 12th in 1861. This is when Burke and Wills likely reached the Gulf of Carpentaria on the 10th. This meant that at the exact moment the Gugedj were guiding them through the delta, indigenous Australians were being cut down by gunfire elsewhere in the colony. These atrocities would continue, by the way, and towards the end of 1861, dozens more Indigenous Australians would lay dead in Queensland. But for now, let's go back to Burke and Will's journey. They'd done what had seemed impossible in those first few weeks of drudgery in Victoria. They'd actually crossed Australia, but now they'd need to return. After reuniting with the others at Bynoe, they began the long, painfully slow journey back to Cooper Creek. As supplies dwindled, the party became increasingly desperate. Camels were shot for meat, as well as their only horse. But you can only shoot a horse once, and so the men were quickly hungry again. They began eating anything they could find along the way, including a black-headed python that Gray had caught. This immediately made Burke and Gray ill with dysentery, slowing their progress even further. By now, the men were growing closer and closer to death, and tensions were beginning to flare. On the morning of March 25th, Gray was desperately weak. His standard ration of porridge was not giving him the strength he needed. But when he tried to steal more from the communal supply, he was discovered by an enraged Burke, who administered a swift beating. It's uncertain quite how badly Burke had pasted Gray. He certainly survived the walloping, but his condition worsened. By April 8th, he was no longer able to walk, and yet somehow he remained with the group for another 9 days. On April 17th, 1861, Charles Gray became the first of the party to die. The 3 survivors pushed on. If they could just make it back to the supply depot at Cooper Creek, they'd have a chance. Unbeknownst to them, however, back at Cooper Creek, the situation was similarly dire. Firstly, William Wright had never returned from his resupply mission. Instead, he'd just been hanging around in Menindee and had only begun the journey in January. Running low on water, Wright and his party were moving at a snail's pace, and even worse, 3 of their men, the naturalist Charles Stone, as well as William Purcell and Dr. Ludwig Becker, were close to death. Wright decided to stay put, setting up camp at the Bullu River, far from the south of Cooper Creek. This meant that Bra and the 4 others were basically all alone, with no hope of resupply. And what's more, they'd stayed at Cooper Creek far longer than they were supposed to. Bra's men had agreed to wait 13 weeks, but when Burke and his party didn't return from the north, they decided to hang around for 5 more, in the vain hope that their comrades would show. But when William Patton fell from his horse and badly injured his leg, Bray knew their position was hopeless. If they stayed, Patton would die, and so they decided to leave Cooper Creek, returning to Menindee. They stashed supplies under a coolabah tree, now known today as the Burke and Wills Dig Tree. After etching messages into the bark, just in case their friends might return, they set out to take the wounded Patton to safety. It was now April 21st, 1861. That evening, just 9 hours after Bra had departed, Burke and Wills and King entered the abandoned camp. It took Bra and his men 8 days to reach the Bullu River, and here they found William Wright and his resupply party in a spot of bother. Wright and his men weren't alone on the Bullu. The Kulali people were already there and had been for generations. The Kulali were not exactly overjoyed to suddenly find a whole load of armed Europeans in their midst, and this is when Wright and his party learned how not to deal with the local population. As tensions rose between Wright's group and the Kulali, skirmishes began to break out. The Europeans set up a stockade, but even within the protection of the walls, the group was slowly dying. Charles Stone was the first to go, Purcell and Dr. Becker followed soon after. When Bra's men straggled into view on April 29th, Wright was only too happy to follow them back to Menindee. They would make it, but it would be a bit too late for Patton. He would succumb to complications from his leg injury, becoming the 5th member of the expedition to die. Meanwhile, back at Cooper Creek, Burke, Wills and King were coming to terms with their abandonment. It must have been pretty devastating, particularly as Brer had carved the date on a tree at the supply depot, so they would have known that they'd missed their companions by a matter of hours. But at least now they had a few supplies and a chance at survival. By April 23rd, the three men were on the move again, but rather than heading back the way they'd come to Menindee, they changed course. They'd head for South Australia and for a cattle station close to Mount Hopeless. This meant crossing 150 miles of desert. The next days were a grueling affair as the three men followed the line of Cooper Creek. The camels were by now faring badly. One had to be shot, and then the last one died on May 7th. The loss of that last camel was a disaster. With no way to carry their supplies, there was no way for the men to cross the desert. They were stranded on the bank of Cooper Creek, and they were slowly dying. But then, the men received a lifeline. They stumbled upon a Yandruwanda community. When all seemed absolutely hopeless, the generosity of the local indigenous peoples saved them once again. Just like the Gugach had done, the Yandruwanda offered the desperate men food and water. They were even given pituri, a mixture of leaves and wood ash chewed as a stimulant. Over the next week, a series of Yandruwanda groups quite literally kept the men alive. They slept in gunya huts at night and dined on fish and meat by day. At some point in May, Wills returned to the Digtree to save more items in the cache there, and on his journey back, he found other Yandruwanda groups who also welcomed and sheltered him. Without this generosity, the men had no chance. They simply could not have survived as long as they did. But then a wild sequence of events brought all that to an end. While being cared for by the Yandruwanda, it seems Burke had his oilcloth stolen by one of the clan's young men. Or at least, that's what he believed had happened. Despite his failing health, Burke gave chase, firing his pistol at the man as he fled. Meanwhile, paranoia had taken over King too. He rounded up a group of Yandruwanda and fired a series of warning shots over their heads. When more Yandruwanda arrived, with nets of freshly caught fish, King and Burke essentially robbed them at gunpoint. As the frightened indigenous tribespeople left the area, Burke and King began figuring out what to do next. They might not have the Yandruwanda anymore, but at least they had the fish they'd stolen. And now Burke made another blunder. Driven by almost delirious hunger, he managed somehow to get a fire going and cooked the fish, but in the process he burned down the gunya and destroyed most of their remaining belongings. He'd been on the brink of disaster for months, and now they were stumbling headlong into catastrophe. By June, Wills was back with Burke and King, and the trio were fending for themselves on the banks of Cooper Creek, and the Yandruwanda wouldn't be coming to their rescue anymore. But there was one thing that might just save them: the knowledge of bushcraft that the indigenous clan had passed on to them. The Yandruwanda had shown them how to make nardoo bread, or bush bread, using the ground-up seeds of spinifex and pigwig plants. For indigenous peoples, this was a staple when out in the bush. It not only kept them alive, but also strong and alert. But only, and this is crucial, only if it's prepared correctly. If nardoo bread is prepared incorrectly, it becomes dangerously poisonous. It saps the body of thiamine, or vitamin B1. This causes beriberi, a debilitating disease, and it will come as no surprise that the sorry trio were doing exactly that, preparing the bread incorrectly. What should have been giving them strength was in fact making them dangerously ill. As Wills wrote in his diary, "My pulse is at 48 and very weak, and my legs and arms are nearly skin and bone." It couldn't last. By now the men knew they wouldn't make out alone. They'd need to be rescued, and, of course, no help was coming. Exactly what happened next, we still don't know for sure though. What we do know is that Wills was still alive on June 29th, as he made a note in his diary on this day. But before the end of the month, he'd grown too weak to continue and told the others to go on without him. Shivering and alone beneath the great outback sky, he wouldn't have lasted long. Burke and King kept moving for at least another 2 days until Burke too collapsed. He seems to have loaded and cocked his pistol in his final moments, perhaps preparing to bring about his end a little quicker. But as it turned out, he didn't need to. He expired, pistol still in hand, around June 1st, without firing a shot. Now, only King remained. While Wills was still alive, though, he'd written in his diary that King seemed to fare better on the nardoo bread, but even if this was the case, King wouldn't survive long by himself. He now understood that the Yandruwanda represented his only chance of survival. And so, when the exhausted King encountered another group of Yandruwanda, he was on his best behaviour. The group took him in, fed and sheltered him, and undoubtedly saved his life. This time, he used his firearm for good. He helped the clan's hunting parties, shooting birds for their collective meat supplies. He also used his medical training to treat a skin sore suffered by a woman named Karawa, and soon King was fully accepted. He was still with Yandruwanda on September 15th when a rescue expedition led by naturalist and explorer Alfred Howitt found him 11 months after he'd set out from Royal Park. King had survived, 7 others did not. Only Burke and Wills had successfully crossed to the Gulf, but neither of them made it home. Nonetheless, though, the Burke and Wills expedition has become etched into Australia's national story. While it was, in many senses, a complete disaster, elements of it were successful. They mapped new areas of territory that had never been sighted by Europeans before. They collected samples of flora and fauna never before seen by European eyes. The journey also helped to form the national identity that would develop over the next 4 decades until the Federation of Australia was formed in 1901. The dogged determination of the story's protagonists helped to propagate the idea of the rugged, hardy European Australian, capable of taking any challenge in his or her stride. Someone who could venture into the outback on a noble quest, take risks, make sacrifices, and achieve big things. As William Wills Sr. wrote about his late son in 1863, he resigned his life without a murmur. Having devoted it to science and country, his name should be handed down to posterity. Australia was still very much a collection of colonies in the 1860s, and many Australians still referred to Britain as back home. But the sacrifice of Burke and Wills helped to push the fledgling state closer towards nationhood. An Australian dream of sorts was being born. It's just a shame that this dream wasn't extended to everyone. For decades before the Burke and Wills expedition, there'd been massacres of Indigenous people right across the 6 colonies, and for decades after the expedition, these massacres continued. There are simply too many to describe in detail. In every decade from 1780s onwards, the Australian independence in 1901 and even beyond, tales of mass killings abound. 15 people shot dead here, 40 shot dead there, 150 more murdered somewhere else. Indigenous people were repeatedly reduced to numbers in newspaper columns and police records, and those are just the ones we know about. In 1918, an unknown number of Kayardild people were murdered on the Bentinck Island of the Gulf of Carpentaria. It's likely that Burke and Wills would have seen the island when they reached the Gulf. The men were shot down or driven into the sea to drown. Then, a group of Kayardild women were taken hostage, where they were assaulted repeatedly for several days. No one was ever prosecuted for these crimes, and the massacre wasn't even known about until the 1980s. And official, police-mandated massacres were still taking place long after this. The final, officially recognised massacre took place in Coniston, Northern Territory in 1928. Officially, 31 Walpuri and Kaiditch people died. But the true death toll could be as high as 200. All of this was made possible by a condescending and dehumanising view of native peoples. Ideas of social Darwinism twisted and distorted the theories of Charles Darwin, painting Indigenous groups as somehow inferior or unintelligent or perhaps subhuman. This view continued to flourish into Australia long into the 20th century. Right up until the 1960s and even beyond, Indigenous children were taken from their homes and placed with white families. The aim was to breed out the colour. It could be argued it was a form of genocide. The bitter irony of this, of course, is that while these ideas were gathering strength, the supposedly unintelligent indigenous peoples were giving Burke, Wills and King the knowledge and skills they would need to survive, like how to properly make nardoo bread, something the trio fatally forgot. To be fair on Australia's colonial authorities, though, the assistance of the Yandrawanda people did not go unnoticed, and in the aftermath of the expedition, the Yandrawanda were presented with ceremonial breastplates, thanking them, as the inscription reads, for, quote, the humanity shown to the explorers Burke, Wills and King in 1861. The Yandrawanda were probably very pleased with their ceremonial breastplates, but they and their fellow Indigenous Australians may have preferred something a little more useful, like the right to respect and decency, or the right not to be gunned on their own land.